because David was a cryptographer, he was using codes and ciphers and handling incredibly confidential material for years. And the RCMP, of course, would be rather concerned that he had all those codes in his head. And so why wouldn't they ask Dr. Cameron to erase them for him?
Erase David Nixon's memories. What could Ken Sudhughes possibly be talking about? Welcome to Queer Legends, an oral history podcast, as we explore the shocking research experiments and misuse of illicit drugs and stimulants, not by hippies and peaceniks, but by the RCMP and Government of Canada and doctors who should have known better to wage a war against Canadian homosexuals, better known as the LGBT Purge. I'm your host, Sean Dern. Season 2 of Queer Legends is supported in part by a community grant from the LGBT Purge Fund. By 1960, 2 years of investigations by the RCMP's most experienced members turned up a preliminary count of homosexuals in government employment. Now authorized to conduct investigations across sensitive and non-sensitive departments and agencies, declassified documents from the LGBT Purge lawsuit show that the RCMP's initial focus on Ottawa identified about 700 known or suspected homosexuals in the broader investigation by May of that year. Almost half of those people had no connection to the federal government at all. 5 months on, the RCMP's investigation into homosexuals climbed to 870, with nearly half concerning Canadians with no link to the government. One self-identified gay informant in Ottawa told investigators that the local homosexual population was at least 3,000. The RCMP was intrigued. However, with no way to confirm, this evidence was used to justify the expansion of already massive surveillance efforts in the National Capital Region in an effort to gain as much information as possible on, quote, the whole homosexual community in and around Ottawa, unquote. Sadly, about 1/3 of folks identified as queers left the jobs they loved through forced resignations or dismissals. Others took transfers to lesser jobs with no chance of training or promotion. But none of this compares to what happened to the late David Nixon. Here is Ken Sudhughes to explain.
It wasn't until he was in the Congo in 1961, actually it was late 1960, he was made a diplomatic courier for the trip. And anyway, once he arrived in Leopoldville, I think he may have been somewhat indiscreet because it was in early 1961 when he'd been spending quite a bit of time with the first secretary from the Dutch embassy that he was recalled.
And what does he write about that recall?
The way he described it, this was verbal. He never wrote this down, but I heard the stories many, many times over the years because we were together for 29 years. And he had applied for leave to go on vacation, but the leave request was refused, and the response was that Nixon was to return Ottawa immediately. And a few weeks after he was back in Ottawa, he was invited to an interview with the RCMP. Again, he didn't think much of that because, he was one of the first people who had been at the embassy in Leopoldville to come back to Canada. So he thought maybe they just wanted to debrief him.
Now, when you say invited for an interview with the RCMP, I mean, are you talking about like they called up and said, could you send him over?
No, he was essentially summoned, and a car came to pick him up, and he went voluntarily.
And then off he goes. And what happened to him next?
Well, he was ushered into an office with somebody at the desk in the office, but it was late in the afternoon, and the sun was coming in the window behind the person at the desk, and the blinds were angled in such a way that David couldn't actually see who he was talking to. And the first thing out of the man's face when David was sitting opposite him was, "We have reason to believe you're a homosexual. As such, you're a security risk. And if you choose to resign, that's fine. And if you choose to not resign, we will proceed further and to make sure that you are removed." So that was that's where it went. So he resigned. And of course, he couldn't tell anybody about why he had resigned. Here he was, having this wonderful career with the government, and suddenly he up and quit. And he was unable to tell anybody why. No reference, no nothing.
And then what does he do? So he's out. I mean, what happened? What happens to his life at that point?
Well, it fell apart. This was early 1961, April of 1961. The way he put it was that he couldn't work for anybody. He didn't feel like going to work. He contemplated suicide. And this was, April 1961. A few months later, he decided to leave the country. A very good friend of his was an actress and dancer on the stage in London. And so he went to visit her, and she got him a job working for one of the other theaters in the West End where she was, and they shared a flat. But he was essentially circling the drain. He was very depressed, very, very upset.
That's when they also start to reach out to people like Dr. Frank Wake, who is a psychology professor at Carleton University, which is where I work, in order to come up with something like the fruit machine, which was supposed to help them identify homosexuals.
You'll remember Patrizia Gentili from our previous episode. She is co-author with Gary Kinsman of the Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation, the first book to be written about Canada's anti-queer purge campaign. Patrizia Gentili is also a professor at Carleton University. The fruit machine might sound trivial, but its name was a direct nod to the homophobic attitudes of the time. The so-called fruit machine was neither about fruit, nor was it a machine. Its name came from a homophobic slur. This project, which lasted only a short time in the 1960s, reveals the extreme lengths that the government and RCMP officials were willing to go to in their hunt for homosexuals. According to documents released to the LGBT Purge Fund through the class action settlement, in May 1960, the RCMP submitted a paper to the Secretary of the Cabinet on homosexuality within the government service. In addition to other troubling measures, they proposed forming a small committee of security panel members to craft a specific policy targeting homosexuals, essentially a more exclusive group of straight white men from the already covert and select security panel.
So it's the security panel says to the RCMP, and the RCMP commissioner is part of this discussion. They all decide that they need some kind of much more efficient way to be able to identify homosexuals.
In one of the declassified documents, former RCMP Commissioner Clifford Walter Harvison is credited as making the first formal proposal for an effective medical research program into the problem of the homosexual and national security to a special group of the security panel. By this time, by the way, nearly 1,000 people were under investigation by the RCMP for being or suspected of being homosexuals. Like before, nearly half of these people had no connection to the government or government jobs at all. Within the government's ranks, not all were in agreement with the prevailing tactics. Samuel Hughes, the chairman of the Civil Service Commission, voiced his apprehensions regarding the rapidly intensifying investigations. He pointed out that these probes were predominantly driven by mere suspicion rather than concrete evidence, signaling a potential overreach by the investigating bodies and a deviation from standard procedural justice. In the official records, there are discrepancies about the project's timeline and the decision makers. Despite the vast number of new historical documents now available, specifics remain lost to time. However, what has regrettably become known as the fruit machine was actually a series of unethical human experiments using questionable psychological tests and unscientific machinery. It was established between June and September of 1960. On June 24th of that year, at a special meeting of a quorum of the security panel, meaning the bare number of people needed to hold the meeting, somebody, quote, proposed the establishment of a research program in search of clinical tests which could discover homosexual tendencies in applicants for government positions, unquote. The RCMP and the Privy Council, or PCO, seemed to be of the opinion that any viable test developed could be utilized to bar homosexuals from all forms of government service, not just employment. Their reasoning? In their minds, queers were criminals. All of us. Sections 147 and 149 of the Criminal Code of Canada at that time classified homosexuals as criminals by practice. RCMP Commissioner Clifford Harvison suggested setting up a body of experts to figure out if they could come up with tests that would help in the hiring process for appointing people to vulnerable government jobs.
They decide to approach Dr. Frank Wake, who is at the time working in the psychology department at Carleton University. And they say to him, can you find out, using the latest, quote unquote, scientific knowledge about homosexuality, to help us come up with a machine that we could use to be able to find out who's queer and who's not.
The historical document shed new light on the narrative that commonly places the blame on the RCMP for all of this. It now emerges that Canada's highest echelons of bureaucracy were not only aware, but actively engaged in the process. It seems that the Privy Council office, typically behind the scenes, was in communication with Carleton University's Dr. Frank Wake before the RCMP, given that he had submitted an interim report at the security panel's meeting in June. This revelation implicates the PCO alongside the RCMP, indicating that top bureaucrats were also complicit and worked with Dr. Wake on the initiatives that led to the infamous Fruit Machine project, information that reshapes our understanding of these historical events. Carleton University granted a sabbatical to Wake, enabling his full-time devotion to using science to find gay people. The report recommended, quote, that a fully considered research program be instituted in order to develop suitable methods of selecting personnel for sensitive positions, and that the departments concerned institute a program of training aimed at developing the fullest awareness on the part of employees concerned of all aspects of this threat, unquote. This is a perfect time to share this little nugget from the same document. Quote, there have in fact been more cases, some of them successful, in which Canadian officials have been blackmailed for illicit heterosexual behavior than for that of a homosexual nature, unquote. So, contrary to the rationale for targeting homosexuals, it was heterosexual men with affairs who faced successful Soviet blackmail. By this point, there was just one known gay man to face a blackmail attempt, and he reported it to his superiors immediately, but was still forced to resign. In late September 1960, a preliminary study of their so-called homosexual problem was made at PCO's request by Dr. Frank Wake of Carleton University. This became a basis for discussion with Progressive Conservative Prime Minister John Diefenbaker and his Minister of Justice, Davy Fulton.
Basically, what happens is that Dr. Wake goes on sabbatical, and while he's on sabbatical, he works with the National Research Council, which is another federal agency.
The small special committee of the security panel made a fairly intensive study of problems of so-called human weaknesses, particularly homosexuality, in relation to security clearances during 1961 and 1962. This same group, quote, agreed that a modest research program be set up with additional assistance of the Defense Research Board and the National Defense Medical Center to determine the possibility of devising acceptable means for identifying problems of this kind, unquote. During his sabbatical, Dr. Wake and Mr. Don Wall of the Privy Council office went to the United States to learn from the experiences of the FBI, CIA, and the U.S. National Security Agency, or NSA, in how America dealt with its so-called homosexual problem. Wake's itinerary said that he intended to visit those centers of psychological testing where other techniques of possible use to the Canadian government were known to be under development, including a Harvard University study of emotional changes by means of fantasy analysis.
He's given, which at the time was a lot of money, $10,000 in funding by the security panel to create, which was now is called a battery of psychology tests. Some, including, which existed at the time, masculinity and femininity scales, a polygraph, what we would call a polygraph machine, a concoction where a camera would be set up, taking pictures of people's pupils while they were looking at pictures of half-naked men, a word association test that apparently contained what he called homosexual words.
Investigators coerced the cooperation of, quote, a number of known male homosexuals for Dr. Wake's experiment, and the RCMP also provided technicians from its identification branch to construct a testing apparatus, unquote. It was the RCMP's Identification Services branch that built the crude contraption that allegedly tested men to see if they were queer or not. The documents say the branch embraced a broad range of filed records and identification data, which were available to all police departments and penal institutions in Canada, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
So it's not a machine, but it's a battery of tests. But all of these things I've described were already circulating in the discipline of psychology as seen as ways for people to figure out who is deviant and who is not. Okay, so Frank Wake basically comes up with this report. He calls it the special report.
Now here is a shocker. The government's own documents say that, quote, Dr. Wake agreed that skepticism was needed in the whole approach to this problem, and that the end result of testing was a best guess, unquote, and nothing more. The RCMP received Dr. Wake's special report in late December 1962, and based on their analysis of it, they didn't seem impressed. Quote, this report, although providing valuable insight into the probable scope of the homosexual problem in Canada, dealt primarily with methods of detecting homosexuality and suggested the need for more until a measure or measures of some efficiency had been designed, unquote.
He did not call his battery of tests the fruit machine. That name apparently came from the RCMP who were working.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Apparently some officer who was nearby or was adjacent to these tests said, oh, he's the guy working on the fruit machine.
Exactly. So that's sort of, we don't really know the exact story, but that's sort of, it wasn't him, right? He titled his report the special report. So, which is how academics do things. It's very boring. But that's basically how it comes to be. But it's really important for, I think, everyone who is listening to remember is that they did have people tested. People were brought in to pilot test this battery of tests.
Do we know how many people's lives were ruined as a result of the...
Not definitively. It could be 500, it could be 20. I couldn't tell you with any accuracy.
The Americans and Dr. Frank Wake weren't the only ones that PCO and the RCMP were working with to develop and conduct human research experiments on homosexuals. This brings us back to Ken Sudhughes.
Early in 1962, David came back to Canada, but was living in Montreal. And he found a doctor there and asked for a referral to a psychiatrist, got that. And the psychiatrist who he went to see sent him with a referral to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill, because it was very highly thought of as a psychiatric institute, and thought that David would be able to get some good help there. So he went to the Allen, checked himself in, and was there for about 2 years. And the Allen at the time was being run by Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was working for both the CIA and the RCMP doing brainwashing experiments. And David was one of them.
Wow. Was this just coincidence? You get purged from the Canadian Public Service for being gay and a security risk to being referred by some doctor that deals with mind experiments on behalf of the CIA?
You have to wonder. I think it was coincidental that he got a referral to the Allen, but once he was there, it was not coincidental what was done to him, because the RCMP had been the enforcers for the purge, and then He was in the hands of the RCMP through the Allen as well. Because David was a cryptographer, he was using codes and ciphers and handling incredibly confidential material for years. And the RCMP, of course, would be rather concerned that he had all those codes in his head. And so why wouldn't they ask Dr. Cameron to erase them for them?
How involved was the RCMP with the work that was going on by Dr. Cameron?
Oh, they were deeply involved. They were paying him, as was the CIA. And if you ever see a book or a movie called The Sleep Room, it's all about things going on at the Allen. Many people who were sent there for treatment left the place essentially having their brains erased. They were left essentially as toddlers. They had so much of their brain rubbed out through shock treatment and drugs and so on that they had to relearn their whole lives. It was appalling. There was an NDP MP from Winnipeg, David Orlico, whose wife was one of the victims of Dr. Cameron, and it was he who brought forward a bill in the House of Commons to provide compensation to the victims of the Allen, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was at that time that David and I obtained his patient file from the Allen. It was about 200 pages long. Dr. Cameron himself destroyed all of his own patient files and notes before he died, but the hospital itself maintained their original files on David, and they had 200 pages of them. And it made note of how many shock treatments, or ECTs, electroconvulsive therapy, he had 36 of them. And he was also treated
over how long of a period of time? I mean, even one sounds awful, but to have this 36 times,
about just over a few months. And he was treated with huge amounts of Seconal and other tranquilizers and antipsychotics and all kinds of stuff. When our doctor here in Victoria read through this file, he shook David's hand and congratulated him on still being alive.
Did David have any notes or anything from this period, or is this things he talked to? But how was he feeling when he got out?
He was completely blank. He said he knew who he was, but that was about it. But because he had kept all of his letters, or his dad had kept all of his letters, and he had lots and lots of photos and slides and all this kind of stuff, through talking to his brother and his friends back in Ottawa, he was able to rebuild for himself who he was and where he had been and what he had done. But he was always emotionally fragile after his time at the Allen. And he would have little mini breakdowns on a fairly regular basis, especially in the later years. And he would always say, "I was never like this before the Allen."
So how long do they continue using the battery of tests known as the fruit machine before they kind of go, this isn't working right?
Okay, thanks for asking that follow-up question, because it never really worked, right? So it was obviously a flop because it wasn't based on anything real, right? It's someone's imaginings of what homosexuality is.
The security panel maintained a strict secrecy over its research on homosexuals, as revealed by a now declassified RCMP document which highlights the tight-knit nature of this operation. Quote, "It is recognized that this is a delicate and difficult problem about which the Prime Minister and perhaps 2 or 3 other ministers should be aware." Unquote. By February 1964, documents indicate that Dr. Wake's research had yielded no practical results, marking the endeavor as a complete failure. The project dragged on through the 1960s with little positive result, reads one now declassified memo. Besides its many technical and scientific faults, the RCMP's battery of tests also suffered from not having enough people to test.
When we found the documents associated with the fruit machine, there's this one report from an RCMP officer that says that it's really difficult to recruit women for the pilot test of the fruit machine because RCMP officers find it very difficult to approach women around this question associated with sexuality, which is really interesting because it gives us a glimpse in this context around homosexuality. The RCMP officers themselves, who were tasked with going to find people, test subjects for the fruit machine, were with themselves grappling with questions of impropriety and morality. And yet we also know from the stories of survivors that the women who were subjugated to interrogation and surveillance tactics by police officers were subject to a particular kind of violence that's beyond just the surveillance itself as a form of violence, right? And so, yeah, you know, in a couple of the interviews we did for the book, the sort of language that the women we interviewed, the lesbians we interviewed, spoke about was particularly violent, you know, sort of harsher, you know, more homophobic language used against them, a kind of a touching, a shoving around. The people we interviewed didn't say that they were sexually assaulted.
Some of the folks that I have spoken to have indicated that
that was happening. Yes. So, yeah, so, we know that happened. I'm just, you know, in particular in my experience with the interviews and doing the research for the book, I didn't come across those particular stories, but other kinds of violences that for the gay men that we interviewed, we didn't get the same kind of stories, the same kind of take on those stories.
And is this sort of like the detailed sexual questioning about, you know, what is it that two women do together? Because as I understand it, they weren't asking what men do together so much, but they did want to know.
Exactly. And sort of like, oh, did she touch you this way? It's a kind of a voyeuristic, which is itself kind of violent in this. It's hard to imagine being interrogated and having these questions asked where the lesbians we interviewed talked about how they were asked in major detail to tell the officers in detail what they experienced, how they were touched by their lovers, when, where, and to give sort of lurid details of the sexual act.
What was the point of these questions? It wasn't like they were getting a whole lot of intel about other women. Like, this just seems like a sexually perverse line of questioning that, you know, you don't need to ask.
No, exactly. And that's why we really do see a particularly gendered aspect to these interrogation practices and surveillance practices that is really about not just the moment in time around heterosexism, but also a kind of how dare you, right, go against what we understand as what, you know, women are supposed to only want.
When Dr. Wake's research didn't find a single homosexual, the RCMP even considered using early forms of conversion therapy. Quote, an examination of possible methods of rehabilitating valuable employees might be possible in light of attempts in this direction known to be in progress in the United States. Unquote. Just before Halloween 1963, the Liberal government of Lester B. Pearson spooked queer public servants with Cabinet Directive No. 35, refining its policy to neutralize the threat of Soviet espionage. An old memo sheds light on a shift in policy, stating the most important modifications in the new directive involved an attitude of greater frankness with employees whose reliability or loyalty was in doubt, and provided related procedures for reviewing such cases both within the responsible department or agency and, if necessary, by a board of review composed of members of the security panel. Prior to this change, there was no process for appealing a confirmation of homosexuality. Cabinet Directive No. 35 introduced a chance for employees under suspicion to resolve the doubt, a phrase whose practical implications remain unclear. This marked a significant, if not ambiguous, step towards procedural fairness for public servants accused of homosexuality. The definition of character weaknesses didn't change, but for the first time there was a glimmer of hope. Quote, persons described as those having a character weakness may not be permitted to have access to classified information unless, after careful consideration of the circumstances, including the value of their services, it is judged that the risk involved appears to be justified, unquote. Then, something unexpected happened, completely unrelated to the government's witch hunt, but which would go on to have a huge impact. A Northwest Territories mechanic and former bus driver from Calgary named Everett George Clippert was sent to prison indefinitely just for being gay. Here's the Calgary Gay History Project's Kevin Allen to explain why Everett George Clippert's story matters.
He spent most of the 60s in jail because of his sexual orientation, and his court case made it all the way to the Supreme Court and led to Pierre Trudeau's famous phrase, "The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation," when the Supreme Court in 1967 said that he was a dangerous sexual offender and should be incarcerated for life. So it was really dramatic and very unjust, and it led to some changes, legal changes, to this sort of status of the homosexual in Canada.
Clippert's case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it didn't go well for Clippert or for Canadian queers. The court's ruling essentially criminalized homosexuality to such an extent that queer citizens could be arrested just for being who they are.
Yeah, and there's lots of op-eds, from newspapers all across the country during the day saying, this is too far. And it's even more ironic because the UK, which we inherited our common law practice and history from, decriminalized it this earlier that year. So Canada was going in sort of the opposite direction that Britain was.
In steps then Justice Minister Pierre Trudeau with his legislation that, among other things, relaxed punishment for homosexuality.
In terms of the subject matter it deals with, I feel that it has knocked down a lot of totems and overridden a lot of taboos, and I feel that in that sense it is new, but it's bringing the laws of the land up to contemporary society, I think. Take this thing on homosexuality. I think the view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I think that, what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code. When it becomes public, this is a different matter.
To be clear, Pierre Trudeau's bill wasn't about decriminalizing homosexuality. It simply made a distinction between public and private sexual acts, between two consenting adults over the age of 21. The Clippert case played a big role in shaping public and political opinions that made this change happen.
I talked to his lawyer, Brian Crane, who still practices law in his 90s as well in Ottawa. A very interesting, dynamic man who defended him. And he said that they were there just to test out the case. And so Trudeau got elected the next year in that wave of Trudeau-mania where he was going to drag Canada into modernity.
Know who wasn't going to be dragged into modernity? The Canadian Armed Forces. In May 1967, General Jean-Victor Allard, the Chief of Defence Staff, issued a Canadian Forces Administrative Order, CFAO 19-20. It had the cumbersome and revealing title of Administrative Order 19-20, Sexual Deviation, Investigation, Medical Investigation, and Disposal. This policy reflected the homophobic attitudes of the time, institutionalizing procedures for the investigation and handling of personnel deemed to have sexual deviations. CFAO 1920, quote, defined homosexual as one who has a sexual propensity for persons of one's own sex, unquote. It required members to report awareness or suspicion that another soldier is a homosexual to their commanding officer. The commanding officer was required to conduct a preliminary investigation and was required to call in the Special Investigations Unit, or SIU, if preliminary investigations tended to substantiate the report. CFAO 1920 also very clearly stated that service policy does not allow homosexual members to be retained in the Canadian Forces. Period. Then, in a confidential February 1969 memo, General Allard wrote, I have become concerned with the possible impact on the Canadian Forces from proposed legislation which, if passed by Parliament, will permit homosexual acts between consenting adults. General Allard wanted a way to get around this legislation and used a successful move by Britain's military as precedent. Steps should now be taken, Allard wrote in his memo, to ensure that present regulations for the Canadian Forces are exempted from the application of any new legislation related to homosexual acts between consenting adults. The RCMP, well, there was no stopping them either. At the same time Canadians were being told the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation, the RCMP continued its queer witch hunt. The RCMP had roughly 8,500 Canadians under investigation for being suspected or confirmed homosexuals, largely concentrated in the metropolitan areas of Canada. Now, whip out your trusty late 1960s adding machine for some interesting RCMP math. This startling revelation in the math shows a disproportionate focus on surveillance. Out of the roughly 8,500 Canadians who were watched by the RCMP for their sexual orientation, only about 19% were actually federal government employees. The remaining 81%, a staggering 6,915 individuals, had no employment ties to the government, yet they were still subjected to invasive scrutiny by the RCMP. This statistic underscores the extent to which private lives were being monitored during this period, with a vast majority targeted simply for their identity outside any professional context. With so many homosexual citizens being followed, harassed, intimidated, or worse by the RCMP and their local police force brothers, it wasn't long before these tactics sparked queer resistance.
I'm glad we're getting to this point, because it's a really important part of the Canadian War on Queers as well, is the whole narrative. And that's where we're also, these interviews are also so important, because while these interviews are also about trauma, they also reveal to us the extent of the resistance, the different tactics the queer community in places like Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal, and Vancouver, actually, because we did interviews in Vancouver too, as well as the resistance network, how queers in the military resisted these really, terrible interrogation tactics and surveillance tactics that were also that they were under because of the purge campaign. So, number one, the first thing that's interesting to me about this story, this history, is that while this purge campaign is happening, we also see the expansion of the gay and lesbian community in places like Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. So we're talking about the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, whereas the height of the purge campaign is also the beginning of these new bars coming out, bathhouses, community centers, organizations that are specifically geared towards queers and trans people. Okay, so that's really important. So what we see at the same time and that's a form of resistance, which is the rise of community formation, queer and trans community formation. So that's number one. I'm hoping people get from the book and from the podcast, this interview. But the second thing I think is really important is that people did all kinds of non-cooperation when they were being, for instance, interrogated. They were asked, can you give us a list of all the queer people you have, or can you point out from this photo album who was queer and who wasn't queer? A lot of those people who were interrogated didn't give answers. That's a form of resistance, right? So, your queer legends, your queer heroes are not me or anybody else. It's those people who, in the context of being interrogated, didn't tell who in the picture was queer and who wasn't, or that those people who would be entrapped by the police as a group, and they would only give each other's names during their interrogations, so that kind of stymied the police, right? So, if you and I had been entrapped at the same time, you would say, oh, Pat's queer, and I would say, oh, Sean's queer, and that would be it, right? It wouldn't go further than that. We're already caught. But that's an act of resistance. That's where I think a lot of the hero, and not only that, I think there was also acts of resistance where people, that whisper campaign you were talking about, where people would let other people know, when they had been interrogated, how to behave in an interrogation process. So there was sort of this understanding of sharing knowledge as well. And people knew that the surveillance was happening. That's the other thing that came out of the book, that people knew that the RCMP was doing the interrogation and the surveillance and the, eavesdropping out, and also sort of following and taking pictures of people while in unmarked cars, taking pictures of people coming in and out of bars.
Can we also talk about this photo taking? Because there are literally spies with newspapers held open with holes cut in the Ottawa Citizen or whatever local newspaper where these folks are, right? Like it's almost
I mean,
a comedy.
Yeah,
except it's a horror. It's like a
right.
horror comedy.
This is one of the stories we got from one of the people we interviewed, and he's talking about the early 1960s. He's sitting in the basement bar at the Lord Elgin, which was frequented by queers all the time, including glory holes in the bathroom in the basement of the Lord Elgin. And he tells the story of one evening, this man is sitting down at a table. It's evening. People are having beers and hanging out. And he whips out this newspaper, and there's a little hole, and he's sort of, presumably taking pictures. And that everyone around this man is also sitting, who are queer men. They take out their wallets and they pretend, using as if their wallet is a camera, and start pointing it at this man and clicking it, and that's an important act of resistance, right? Because it's campy, right? Which is
a bunch of queens with their wallet cams.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's campy and it's humorous, but it's also we know you're there. Don't think we don't know, and we're still gonna do what we're doing.
Thank you for listening. Coming up on Queer Legends, we'll cover stories from the 1970s, from the historic 1971 We Demand protest through police actions during the 1976 Montreal Olympics, and learn about the experiences of lesbians in the military and the wider impacts of the 1970s purges.
There was no trial. You were not given any legal counsel. You had no choice. It was them telling you were gone, and you had absolutely no recourse. Now, what's fair about that?
There's still some more to share with you, but first I wanted to say this episode of Queer Legends was created by Sean Dern, with special thanks to Dr. Andrew Birch at the Canadian War Museum for that last clip you heard. Executive producer is Ian Capstick. Season 2 is partially funded by a community grant from the LGBT Purge Fund. We conclude this episode with Ken Sudhughes, whose poignant summary wraps things up. Please be advised, these are challenging yet crucial memories that involve reference to sexual violence.
Well, and it's just this whole thing of finding out through the years how shabbily treated people were. And it wasn't just in the public service. Of course, it's the RCMP, the armed forces, and so on. I have a friend here who was in the Air Force and was very obviously a lesbian. And so at one point she was gang raped to try to straighten her out, and she became pregnant from that gang rape and then had her child taken away from her. So, I mean, it wasn't just David who was treated so shittily. I mean, it just went on and on and on. That's the thing that really appalls me. And it wasn't just the conservative governments doing this, it was the liberal governments as well. So, Pierre doesn't get off too lightly. And Mike Pearson was Minister of Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister, and he was part of it as well. And so, nobody gets off this without being tarred with that brush.
This is Queer Legends, an oral history podcast, a production of Secret Agents. If our stories resonate with you, please show your support with a 5-star rating and a positive review on this platform. You can find us everywhere great podcasts live: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, YouTube, and beyond.